President Obama may have outstretched his hand, but the Castros still have their fists real tight.
Not so fast. Normalizing relations with Cuba won't happen without some resistance from Capitol Hill. Parent teachers. Pope Francis uses his general audience to encourage parents to teach their children. Spiritual response. A Philadelphia priest shares his powerful experience with last week's deadly train crash. And the beauty of faith. We explore sacred art with connections to Sunday's Feast of Pentecost. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, May 20th, 2015. Good evening from Washington. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Brian Patrick with your news now. Issues still dividing the U.S. and Cuba will be addressed at a meeting here in Washington tomorrow. Today, senators had plenty of questions for those brokering the deal. Susanne LaFrankie reports from the White House tonight.
Brian, the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee continued to hold hearings today about whether or not to open relations with Cuba. One thing is evident: there is major concerns with both Republicans and Democrats.
Their views on human rights are not legitimate. They're immoral.
President Obama may have outstretched his hand, but the Castros still have their fists real tight.
Before considering reopening embassies in Washington and Havana, senators want reassurances.
Human rights abuses continued unabated, with more than 1,600 cases of arbitrary political arrest this year alone.
In April, President Obama met with Cuban President Raul Castro at the Summit of the Americas in Panama. Cuba wants the U.S. economic embargo lifted and Guantanamo Bay closed. And some lawmakers say the Cuban people would directly benefit from thawing the half-century Cold War.
These companies have an opportunity to make an incredible difference in the lives of everyday Cubans by connecting them to the outside world.
Pope Francis welcomed Cuban President Raul Castro to the Vatican earlier this month. He personally encouraged the U.S. and Cuba to reopen dialogue. But Senator Marco Rubio, a Cuban American, says the Holy Father's priorities are different than the U.S. government's.
The Pope is a spiritual leader who I think is always looking to bring people together. The interest of the United States is for there to be freedom and democracy on the island of Cuba.
Well, the clock is ticking on Cuba's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism. The Obama administration lifted that designation about 45 days ago. That is set to expire May 29th. Brian?
Thanks, Susanne LaFrankie at the White House tonight. Some of the other stories our EWTN News Nightly team has been covering in today's world. Pope Francis focuses on the role of parents as the primary educators of children. During today's general audience, he says many parents are kidnapped by their work and other worries. The Holy Father says so-called experts have usurped parents, even in the most intimate aspects of education. The Pope encourages parents to be concerned first and foremost with their children's soul. At the end of today's audience, he made a special appeal for prayer for Catholics in China.
Noi chiederemo a Maria di aiutare I cattolici in Cina.
The Pope, following Benedict XVI's example, asks Our Lady to help Catholics in China. In 2007, Benedict expressed his hope that the whole world pray for the Church in China on the Feast of Mary Help of Christians, which is this Sunday. Italian police arrest a Moroccan man on suspicion that he helped to organize and execute an attack on Tunisia's Bardo Museum. That attack left 22 people dead. The suspect was arrested at the home of his mother and brothers near Milan. Italian authorities say he arrived in Italy February 7th with migrants from a smuggler's boat. Italian police believe that he returned to Tunisia to help organize the March 18th attack in Tunis. Anti-immigrant politicians have warned that Islamic extremists might enter Italy on migrant boats. Indonesia and Malaysia agree to provide temporary shelter to thousands of migrants stranded at sea. This is the first breakthrough in the humanitarian crisis confronting Southeast Asia. For weeks, there's been reluctance by that region's nations to take responsibility. Most of these migrants are members of the long-persecuted Muslim majority in Myanmar. Others are Bangladeshis fleeing poverty. Pope Francis is asking the world to pray for the dear people of Burundi. His prayer this past Sunday, may the Lord help all to flee from violence and to act responsibly for the good of the country. Police dispersed protesters in Burundi's capital today after the country's president signed a decree postponing parliamentary elections. They shot tear gas canisters and live bullets, mostly in the air. Army personnel remained in the area but didn't intervene. Protesters argue the incumbent president's bid for a third term is illegal because the Constitution only allows 2 5-year terms. The elections are now scheduled for June 5th. Nebraska lawmakers give final approval to a bill abolishing the death penalty. They have enough votes to override a promised veto from Republican Governor Pete Ricketts. The vote was bolstered by conservative senators opposing capital punishment for fiscal and religious reasons. 32 states still have the death penalty. 18 have abolished it. The latest was Maryland. A longtime confidant of Hillary Rodham Clinton has been subpoenaed to testify before a special House panel. This according to an official close to the probe of the deaths of 4 Americans at the U.S. diplomatic post in Benghazi, Libya. The official, speaking anonymously, says the panel has a number of questions for Sidney Blumenthal. Panel members want to know if he had any business arrangements that led him to send emails to Clinton concerning Libya while she was Secretary of State. Blumenthal was not employed by the State Department at that time. Clinton, who is seeking the Democratic Party's presidential nomination, campaigned in Iowa this week. Sarah Westwood is with us, political reporter for the Washington Examiner. And after a long silence, Mrs. Clinton finally answered some questions this week. Did she say anything of substance?
She certainly chose her words very carefully. She structured her answers so as to, be measured in her response. She addressed the issue with Sidney Blumenthal just by calling him an old friend that she sometimes spoke with while she was in government. And so we didn't really see any substantive defense of the more serious allegations against her and Sidney Blumenthal.
Does it seem strange to you that she's running for president yet avoiding the reporters who are following her campaign?
Right. It's not just that she's running for president, but that there are very serious and even potentially criminal allegations against some people that surrounded her at State Department and her herself. So just the fact that she is a candidate and that she has some very serious problems surrounding her campaign should really make voters question why she is dodging these questions.
So now she's pushing for the emails to be released by the State Department. Why now?
Well, we did see her tweet out in response to the initial controversy in March that she wanted those emails to be released. But certainly we can't expect too much sensational material to be contained within them because, as you remember, she herself censored those emails before she gave them over to the State Department and then presumably erased the rest. So we might not be looking at any smoking guns to come out of these.
Let's look briefly at the Republican field. Is anyone gaining any momentum in the growing field?
Surprisingly, no. The poll numbers have been very tight all across the board. If you've ever seen frontrunners start to emerge, such as Jeb Bush did in the early stages, he stumbled on an answer to a question about whether he would go into Iraq like his brother did. That certainly might have hurt him in the polls. We've seen Scott Walker sort of step back from the spotlight, and there are so many candidates in the field that really support is diluted among them right now.
Do you see any weak links in there? Anyone dropping out first?
Well, it's really impossible to know until we get to the early states, until we get to the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primaries. That's usually when you start to see some of the underdogs bow out. But for now, we will just have to see who is able to consolidate some of the GOP support around the country.
Well, we know you'll be watching the race for us, and we look forward to having you back. Sarah Westwood from the Washington Examiner. Thank you.
Thank you.
Federal investigators suggest it may be a year before we know why an Amtrak train derailed in Philadelphia last week. 8 people died, more than 200 were injured. Jason Calvi spoke today with a parish priest who rushed to the scene of that crash.
What was it that compelled you? What made you want to go there when you heard all those sirens?
Well, I knew it was a catastrophe. I knew it was a tragedy, and I knew people were hurt. I figured people had died already, and I figured that the priest needed to be on the scene, the church needed to be present, and I just, thank God, I guess I was impelled by the Holy Spirit to go forth and to do what I could. And talking to police officers, they appreciated my presence, and I did meet some folks at the Webster School that I was able to minister to and give some water and coffee and cookies to.
What did you say to those victims and to the survivors?
Interestingly enough, there were probably about 15 people in the Webster School, and many of them were speaking to police officers, just getting some testimony. I was able to meet a family from Singapore, and the one young lady was sitting there by herself, rather distraught. The tears were starting to come out of her eyes, and I just sat next to her and said, "I'm really sorry. This is a terrible night for you and your family." Her parents, they were on vacation in the States, and her parents were in Einstein Hospital, and they were okay. She had talked to them on the telephone. You know, basically I said, "I'm sorry, and I'm going to keep you in my prayers, and if there's anything I can do for you now, let me know." Is volunteered to drive them to the hospital, but the ambulance came for them and took them to the hospital. So really that was what I was able to do for the folks at the Webster School, to sit with them, talk to them, offer whatever comfort I could.
Well, Father, thank you very much for your time and for your ministry.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Jason. The church in El Salvador prepares to raise Archbishop Oscar Romero to the status of blessed on Saturday. He was shot and killed while celebrating Mass in 1980. Pope Francis declared him a martyr, saying he was killed out of hatred for the faith. An American priest who knew Romero says many are celebrating his beatification.
And that gives a lot of satisfaction and joy to the Salvadoran people, especially the most vulnerable, that suffer the most, and who felt closest to Bishop Romero.
Romero's case was held up for years, mainly due to concerns over his perceived connection with liberation theology. Coming up, big banks hit with big fines for criminally manipulating world markets. And a strong U.S. dollar is not all good news, especially for U.S. exporters. Do we seek to understand where our children truly are on their path? Where is their soul? And above all, do we want to know? From today's audience, Pope Francis highlighting the spiritual responsibility of parents. Thanks for joining us for EWTN News Nightly this Wednesday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. The people of Ireland vote this Friday on whether or not to redefine marriage. Ireland's constitution was written in collaboration with Catholic leaders in 1937. It gave inalienable rights to married couples, but does not specify marriage is between a man and a woman. Polls show most of Irish voters support marriage redefinition, but the lead is narrowing. Conservative campaigners raise concerns about the impact on children. Dublin's Archbishop says people should examine their conscience before voting. Michael Kelly is joining us by Skype from Dublin, Ireland. He's editor of the Irish Catholic, that's a national newspaper in Ireland. And Michael, what is the strategy to keep marriage as defined between one man and one woman in Ireland ahead of Friday's vote?
Well, Brian, the strategy really is to try to keep the concentration on children. There has been a big push by those campaigning for change, those campaigning for a yes vote to same-sex marriage, to try to say that this is nothing about children, that this is simply a measure about equality. In fact, they've been trying to characterize those who believe in traditional marriage, those who are opposed to change, as people who are opposed to equality. So really what you're seeing, the main campaign group on the no side, for example, is called Mothers and Fathers Matter. The campaign really is to keep the concentration around children, precisely because if this constitutional redefinition goes ahead, that will create for same-sex couples who enter civil marriages, that will create for them a right to procreate. So the yes side are very keen not to talk about children. The no side are very keen to talk about children.
Michael, aren't civil partnerships already legal in Ireland? So why this push to specifically redefine marriage?
We've had civil partnerships for 5 years now in Ireland for same-sex couples, and there's actually very little legal differences between that and marriage as we understand it now. This is of symbolic value in many ways to the gay lobby. They feel that civil partnerships are not protected by the Constitution. They're not mentioned in the Constitution, whereas if this redefinition of marriage goes ahead, that means that same-sex marriage will enjoy constitutional protection and will be recognized in the Constitution. Therefore, they see this as an affirmation, a full affirmation of same-sex relationships. So that's why there's the push to redefine marriage, to have same-sex couples on an equal footing with traditional marriage, and also the fact that the Constitution does confer that right to procreate, with the obvious implications there for surrogacy, adoption, and assisted human reproduction.
Of course, Ireland is a traditionally Catholic country. Things have changed in recent years. Is there still a Catholic vote there, and how do you predict it will go?
Well, still about 43% of Irish people attend Mass at least once a week, which by Western European standards is very high. The bishops in their various dioceses have been issuing pastoral letters. They've been asking Catholics to think very carefully about this, to understand the full implication of this, that this is not about equality, that this is a radical redefinition of marriage. On the opposite side, though, there have been some prominent priests who have been coming out calling on Catholics to vote yes. So it's difficult to predict what way Catholics will in fact vote. I think one thing we can be clear about is that there's no specific Catholic vote in the way there was in the past, but one would have to think that a lot of those Mass-going Catholics will in fact be influenced by the pastoral letters coming from the bishops.
The editor of the Irish Catholic joining us from Dublin, Michael Kelly. Thanks for being with us. Well, 4 big banks will pay $2.5 billion in fines, pleading guilty to criminally manipulating the global currency market dating back to 2007. The settlement is between the banks and the U.S. Justice Department.
4 of the world's largest banks have agreed to plead guilty to felony antitrust violations. They are Citicorp, J.P. Morgan Chase & Company, Barclays PLC, and the Royal Bank of Scotland PLC. These 4 banks have acknowledged their role in this conspiracy.
Major banks have been fined billions for their role in the housing bubble and subsequent financial crisis. Even so, these latest penalties are indeed big. The U.S. dollar's gain is pain for some U.S. exporters, while it's giving importers a lift. The recent wild currency fluctuations leave many wary of what might come next. For manufacturer GMM, it's all about non-stick coatings. But with factories around the world, the one thing the company's Chicago-based owners is stuck with is fallout from a strong U.S. dollar.
Currency is something that GMM Non-Stick Coatings has to think about. We're a very global business.
GMM's operations in China haven't directly been hurt by the greenback's gains, but elsewhere, the company's products have taken a hit.
Our European clients, they come to us and say, we may not be able to afford your product. We haven't changed anything in our product, but obviously it has become something like 20% more expensive.
For Americans, the strong dollar means cheaper vacations in Europe and lower prices for some imported goods. It's a different story for U.S. exporters. California-based Green Toys makes everything from recycled plastic milk jugs. The dollar's strength has made their products less affordable for the 90 countries they export to.
We sell really high quality trucks for about $25. If I was selling this for $7, a change in currency would really, really matter.
Currency jumps give headaches to those grappling with cross-border business.
Big multinational corporations with production locations all over the world simply have more levers to pull in terms of adjusting their own production patterns across these countries than perhaps a small business or a smaller business or a single location business.
For now, that means this German winemaker is enjoying a boost of classic Riesling exports.
A weaker euro always means that we have a bigger demand from our export destinations, but we also have to consider and take into consideration that we have a very, very high volatility of currency exchange rates right now, and it can change rather quickly.
I always say the currency giveth and the currency taketh away. If you look at it as short term, it's a challenge or an opportunity. If you look at the long term, it almost always evens out.
Up next, as Pentecost Sunday approaches, we explore the beauty of faith with Dr. Jem Sullivan. And in India, rows of tulips paint a hillside in a brilliant array of color. On this Wednesday, May 20th, The Beauty of Faith. That's the title of Dr. Jem Sullivan's book and our brand new franchise with Dr. Sullivan, The Beauty of Faith. Dr. Jem Sullivan with us tonight, the author of The Beauty of Faith and former docent at National Gallery of Art. It's good to have you with us. Thanks for coming back. So we have the Feast of Pentecost coming up on Sunday, and we're going to start out with an engraving of that incredible moment in the early church history from 1500.
Yes, this engraving from the National Gallery of Art by Giovanni Jacopo Carraglio was made after or in imitation of Raphael, and it is a beautiful image to contemplate as we approach the solemnity of Pentecost. We see the Holy Spirit in the upper room in the form of a dove hovering over the entire scene, and rays of heavenly light radiating down on Mary and the apostles in the space. Small flames of fire rest on the apostles' heads as they together look to the heavens in awe and wonder of the gift that they are receiving. Mary's head is lowered and her hands are folded in prayer, and she is at the center of this composition. Why? Because Mary teaches us how to pray for and to receive the gift of the Holy Spirit in trust, in openness, in faith, and confidence. Mary's entire life was graced by the Holy Spirit. At the Annunciation, she hears the Archangel Gabriel say, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you. The power of the Most High will overshadow you."
The Holy Spirit is her spouse.
That's right.
Intimacy there.
That's right. And now at Pentecost, she receives the Holy Spirit together with the apostles, and she teaches us how to humbly ask for and to gratefully receive this outpouring of the Holy Spirit on the church at Pentecost.
I love the impact of the Holy Spirit coming to the apostles. They were cowering, and then they became bold and proclaiming the faith.
That's right.
And we're called to do the same. So this is still the month of May, so let's look at a piece from that same era, Mary, Queen of Heaven.
In the church's calendar, the month of May is traditionally dedicated to the Blessed Mother. In many parishes, there's a tradition of having children crown a statue of Mary in May. And this image is beautiful altarpiece panel painting from 1485 titled Mary, Queen of Heaven, is a visual homily on the church's devotion and love of the Blessed Mother.
We see colors.
That's right. We see three aspects of Marian iconography: Mary's assumption into heaven, her Immaculate Conception, and her coronation as Queen of Heaven. And all around her, she's surrounded by choirs of angels who are playing various instruments that were popular in the Renaissance, so the trumpet, the lute, and the harp. And then Mary herself, with her hands folded in prayer, and then inviting all of them to join in this beautiful hymn of praise. The angels are also playing before the Blessed Trinity at the top of the scene, the Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And I think the whole scene reminds us that Mary, even as she's being crowned the Queen of Heaven, she remains Mother of the Church on earth, and she is our mother in faith.
It's a painting that you can almost hear. Exactly. So beautiful. Well, the beauty of faith is your book, and we're grateful that you're going to be joining us on a regular basis to show us these beautiful works of art that work in conjunction with our liturgical seasons. Dr. Jem Sullivan, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, Holland is known as the land of tulips, but tourists are flocking to an Indian mountainside for a glorious view of these beautiful flowers. Tens of thousands of tulips provide a sea of color at one of Asia's biggest tulip gardens. There are rows and rows of tulips in red, yellow, pink, white, and blue, all set against the misty mountaintops. Nearly 1 million bulbs in different varieties are planted here each year. India's flowers are in great demand in markets like Europe, Australia, West Asia, and Japan.
Tulip garden is absolutely wonderful, amazing, so beautiful it is. Something we had to go to Netherlands to watch this, and today we have it in our own country.
The cost to enter these tulip gardens? Less than $1 US. That's a real deal. Well, until tomorrow, for our EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Brian Patrick. We say goodnight tonight with moments from the general audience of Pope Francis today in St. Peter's Square.